Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Joe Reingold, and I'm here interviewing Joe Saraviego. Today is Thursday, August 27th, 2020. And Joe, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your background. Let's start with if you know anything about where your grandparents were from, where they lived, what they did for a living, and then your parents, and then we'll worry about coming up to your age, your time a little bit later.
Yeah, so all four of my grandparents were born in Turkey, kind of scattered out in various, what is considered Istanbul now, but different suburbs of Istanbul. And I would say in the 20s or early 30s, my grandfather was on his way was trying to get to the United States. And he had a relative in Cuba, and he stopped in Cuba to stay with him for a while, or for lack of a better term, say hello. But his destination was America. And once he got to Cuba, he kind of got stuck there. He was very young, got on a ship by himself, and ended up in Cuba. My grandmother shortly after that followed. And as I understand the story, they were married in Cuba. And my parents were both born in Cuba. And when Castro came along he came along in 59, but things got a little bit more difficult in 60, 61. And so my parents came to the U.S. permanently. My dad, he was living in Cuba, but my grandfather was able to send him to boarding school in the U.S. So my dad was physically living in the U.S., but was still a resident of Cuba. But my dad came to the U.S. permanently in 61.
Where did they send him? What school was it? What state?
He went to Georgia Military Academy in Atlanta.
Oh, okay.
And then from there, he went to North Carolina State University.
Was it a hard? Did he do the road to citizenship early on?
He did. I think I'm a little fuzzy on how all that happened, but I think early on it was not like it is today, and they basically got political asylum because of everything that was going on in Cuba, and that wave of Cuban immigrants was I don't think it was a very difficult process. I don't think it was very arduous at all.
Okay.
You asked about my grandfather and what my grandparents did for a living. My dad was from a very, very small town called Viva in Cuba. I actually went to visit a few years ago, and when he says small, it's very, very small. No paved roads, anything like that. And my grandfather owned a store in the town. It was the town convenience store. I call it convenience store because it's the size of a convenience store, but it was a department store. It was where you got everything. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather was very industrious, and he decided it was worth living in this small town to have a business where basically everybody came to him. And there too, my dad, when he was a very young boy, I'm talking 7, 8 years old, he was sent off to boarding school in Cuba for his education, and would come home every weekend. And something that when we were there that struck me, my dad's kind of one of those tough guys, and never seen him cry a whole lot. Maybe once or twice when his parents passed away. And then the day that he was telling me the story, that we were sitting on a bench in this town in Cuba, and he would tell me, this little town, you look at it, it's really nothing. There's nothing here. But every time I would get on that bus to go to school, I remember crying the entire way to school, and on the way back, I just remember being the happiest boy ever, just because I got to come home and see my friends and see my family and all that kind of stuff. So, like I said, my grandfather owned a store. And a very interesting story that I kind of glossed over was when they came from Cuba, my grandfather, they basically, the options were stay in Cuba and give everything you own to the government, or you can leave everything you own to the government, but you got to leave here with the clothes on your back. You can't take anything you own with you. So my grandfather went to a shoemaker and had the shoemaker hollow out the soles of 2 shoes, and he went and bought as many diamonds as he could, and he filled the soles of shoes with diamonds, and basically got on an airplane and came to the U.S. with the clothes on his back and the shoes on his feet.
Wow. With a fortune in his feet, right? That's amazing. Wow. So where did you grow up?
I grew up here in Dallas. I was born in Medical City. Still live 5 miles from where I grew up most of my life.
So tell us, how did they make the decision to come here? How did that happen?
So when everybody left Cuba and ended up in Miami, you basically stood in line, and as I understand it, you stood in line, and when you got to the end of the line, they would tell you, they would say, "Do you have any family in the U.S.?" And my mom had a brother that was living in Dallas, and they gave her, a small sum of money. I think it was $20 or something like that, and a plane ticket to come to Dallas. And my dad, who they knew each other through the Jewish community, because my dad, who grew up in this very small town of Viva, and my mom, who grew up in a small town called Artemisa, my mom's town being much larger than my dad's, but still a small town. The Jewish community kind of knew each other, especially the people that came from, that had a similar path. So as I mentioned before, my mom's parents and my dad's parents were both Turkish, and there was events or things that they tried to do in order to get the families together so that they could marry off their children. And so my parents weren't part of that, but they knew each other from those relationships between the families. So my mom used to say, when my dad was in military school, my mom used to send my dad, the stories that I've heard, that she would send him love letters, Dalston perfume as a very young girl, 11, 12, 13 years old. And my dad always just never thought anything of it. But then when my dad graduated from college and he found out that my mom was here and there was some other relatives here, my dad came to Dallas and met up with her, and shortly thereafter they got married.
What was your mom's, what was her journey here, her family? How did they get to Dallas, and why?
Her brother was the only one that was here. I think he just left Cuba kind of earlier than the Castro thing happened. And I really don't know the answer to that. I think he just had an opportunity, probably knew somebody that could get him a job. And I think that's what you did back then.
So do you have any relatives still in Cuba that you know of?
We have some distant cousins, like my dad's first cousin he recently passed within the past couple of years. And so his kids and so some second and third cousins, but nobody that we have really, if you stayed in Cuba, you were considered, for the Castro regime. And this particular cousins of my father's actually did work directly for the Castro regime and became, a leader in the Communist Party. And so my dad and my aunts and uncles that all abandoned Cuba were considered traitors. So that the relationship kind of severed at that point. And so the relationship between the families was not very solid. In later years, obviously, as everybody got older and maybe wiser, when I went to Cuba to visit, I wanted to go to Cuba to see it, obviously. And also I wanted to be toured around by my parents. I didn't want to be toured around by a tour guide that would show me all the historical sites, and I wanted to see where my parents came from. And so I went with my mom, my dad, one of my sisters, and my brother-in-law. Lauren and I had small kids at the time, which a couple years old. And it just didn't seem right. It was a little nerve-wracking to take them with us, so they stayed behind. But we were there for a week, and we toured around, and we actually did have lunch with my dad's first cousin.
Very good. Have they ever been here? Have they tried to come here to visit?
I think his daughter actually lived in New York for a little while. She was she was a musician, I think, and she was touring around. And but if you leave for a purpose such as that and you try to stay, I think there's a negative impact for the family that's still at home. So she ended up going back.
Okay. So let's backtrack for just a minute and tell us a little bit about your life growing up here in Dallas. What kind of activities did you have? How was your schooling? What things were you involved in?
So growing up, like I mentioned, I grew up in Dallas, played all the sports. Was a real neighborhood kid. Loved to play with kids around the neighborhood. Grew up going to several schools. I had some learning disabilities that I think were not quite as well understood or accepted back then. And so I kind of moved around schools thinking that the schools were the problem when I was really the problem, or just hadn't found the right solution. I went to Cuba until third grade. And then after that went to the ISD schools, and then ended up in private school for a while and graduated from Pierce. And then from there went on to Arizona. Temple Emmanuel Hebrew School. One thing I'd like to mention is one of the things that's really near and dear to our heart here in Dallas is Temple Emmanuel, because in Cuba, they had a hard time finding a rabbi that would marry them because they didn't have the money. And Rabbi Klein from Temple Emmanuel stepped up and basically did whatever he had to help them, and married them at Temple Emmanuel. And so grew up going to Temple Emmanuel, still members there today.
Okay. You mentioned Arizona. I assume that's where you went to college?
I did.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about what did you study in college and what kind of work did you do after college?
So I studied mechanical engineering and business at Arizona. After school, my dad, when he was a young man in his early 20s, started a business building machinery. And he had always kind of raised me in that environment and around heavy tools and heavy machinery, and he really wanted me to join his business. I had some other aspirations or thoughts of what I could do, and he convinced me. He still is a very convincing man, and convinced me that the right thing to do is join the family business. And so that's what I'm doing here.
Okay. So we heard from your wife, but now you tell us, how did you meet your spouse, your wife, and where did you decide to settle to live?
Well, what did she tell you?
I can't tell you that. It's privileged. No.
We met at a wedding. We met at Josh Stern and Hillary Chrysler's wedding at the Westin Galleria. It was December 29th, 2002. And my cousin was a groom's brother-in-law, and he actually called and said, I was at the rehearsal dinner last night. I met this girl. Like, you got to be at the wedding. Be there. Dress your best, because this is the girl you're going to marry.
Ooh.
And I said, well, okay, sounds super interesting. What's her name? And he told me her first and last name, Lauren Umansky. And I said, I think I went to college with her brother. And Lauren's brother, Mike, is very tall, and, he's very tall, and I'm not very tall. And I said, I know her. I know Mike, and if she looks anything like Mike, I'm not interested. Hopefully he doesn't see this. But he's already heard that story. And so I went to the wedding, and when we were at the ceremony, we were at Shereth Israel, and I saw this beautiful girl walking down the hallway, and immediately I knew. Nobody had pointed her out. Nobody told me what she looked like. Nothing. And when I saw her, I was like, wow, she's gorgeous, and that's got to be her. So I saw her in the hallway. For me, it was love at first sight. And then we left and went to the party. After we got to the party, my cousin came to me and he goes, "Hey, I want to introduce you to that girl I was telling you about." And he walked me right up to the door, which was the girl I had seen in the hallway. And we talked for a little bit, and then the rest is history. We decided to settle in Dallas because, she had moved around a little bit here and there. She was in graduate school, and I was already involved in my family business and pretty well on my way and pretty dug into Dallas. And so she came here right after she graduated from GW. And, one thing led to another. We were engaged within, I think, 9 months after we met. And then we had I think it was about a 1.5 year engagement. And then we got married at the Fairmont in DC.
Since you were born here, what kind of changes have you seen from Dallas, the city, civically, Jewishly, anything that you can describe from when you were young until now as a married man?
I think that Dallas is I don't know. I can speak for sure for now, for for what's going on now. I think Dallas is one of the most welcoming communities. Lauren's involved in real estate, and she meets a lot of people that come here from other cities and states. And the inclusiveness that is Dallas is second to none. I think that, when new people come to Dallas, there's just so many open arms, inviting people in and introducing them to other Jewish families and inviting them to Shabbat dinners. That I don't know if it was the same, 20, 30 years ago. The Jewish community has definitely gotten, and again, I don't know if this is just because I've gotten older and have met so many people throughout the years, but for me, it's very interesting because a lot of the people that I see at bar and bat mitzvahs or weddings, or at temple or wherever at the JCC are people that I grew up with. Go to the JCC and run into Laura Seymour, who was the camp director when I was a camp director, and she's camp director for my kids. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's kind of like when you see a kid growing up every day, you don't watch them really grow, but when you don't see them for a while, you can see a major difference. So I guess I've seen it, throughout the years, and I've seen Dallas as a city grow and become much more vibrant and more of, I think it's always been a major city in the U.S., but I feel like lately it's become more of it used to be New York, LA. I think Dallas is kind of in that mix now. I've always told people it is a very large, small town.
That's a good description. Yeah. And are you and your wife, or you separately, involved in anything civically and or Jewishly besides Temple Emmanuel?
Lauren is much more involved than I am. She's the best social butterfly that I know. She can work a room with the best of them. So she's involved. She's on the JCC board and the Temple Emmanuel board. We're involved a little bit. We have a lot of friends and very close with Rabbi Dabrowski at Chabad of Dallas, but we're not members just because we associate more with Temple Emmanuel. But I would say the answer to that is JCC, Temple Emmanuel, is our main affiliation.
Okay. What would you consider something that you are very proud of in your life?
There's lots of things. I think that, one of the things, I feel like one of the most important things that you can do in life, and one of the things that we talk to our children about regularly, is, choosing the right partner. And I feel like I chose the right partner in Lauren. We have two boys, that we watch them interact with other people, and in certain situations, and just super proud of I think typically you'd say I'm super proud of my children, but I'm super proud of us for how we are raising them. And I give Lauren a lot more credit than I give myself. But I think, we say that our family is like a little special sauce. You put too much of this in it and a little too much of that in it, and it throws off the flavor. But our little foursome is pretty special.
That's wonderful. Is there anything else, Joe, that you would like to add that we haven't mentioned, or that you'd like to put into this interview?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. Well, we're proud that you grew up here in Dallas and have a good perspective of the whole thing, really. So I thank you very much for your time, and good luck with everything.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you guys taking the time.
Okay.
Thank you for what you're doing. This is super important. I don't know that I'm super important, but I know that there's a lot of wonderful people in Dallas that their stories definitely need to be told and carried on throughout the year. So thank you for what you're doing.
And tell people, please, that it's not just native-born Dallasites that we're interviewing. We interview anybody that's lived here for a while. We're more than welcome to do. We're happy to do that. So, okay.
Wonderful.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.